Hello, I'm Isaiah, and welcome back to the most political walk-in closet in the city. Sorry for the wait, this video script went through several revisions. It doesn't help that things don't stop happening just because I decided to make a video on a certain topic. This month has been a little crazy. If you found this video helpful at all, I would appreciate it if you liked and subscribed. Thanks. Today I'm going to talk about police reform and police brutality. Unfortunately, I was overambitious with this project. As a result, I have decided to split the project into multiple parts. My next video I have in mind includes the police brutality protests, Black Lives Matter, and Antifa. Not everything I say about the police is going to apply to every precinct. We've seen dramatically different statistics depending on where you live. I'm not trying to push an ideology that all police are bad. I'm simply trying to highlight the major issues with our law enforcement system as a whole. I understand that some of you may have family and friends who are police officers, who are excellent servants of the public, and that's great. But we need to understand that there are bad apples in the police force, and there are ways to reduce or even eliminate them completely. Unfortunately, the system the police operate in has created a general distrust for police officers. When a terrible event happens, the entire country feels it, and every police officer suffers for it. People become cold to the police, hostile even. Some will even go as far as adopting harsh ideologies like, all cops are bastards. George Floyd's death opened a sort of Pandora's box of protests for police brutality that isn't closing anytime soon. If we want people to trust and respect the police again, the people need to see meaningful change. Not tearing down some statues, not some rebranding of football teams or syrup companies. Meaningful systemic change is the only way people will trust the police again. Before I go any further, I'd like to state that I respect the police and believe they are a necessity. I have had only good interactions with the police, but it is also important to understand that our perspectives differ greatly depending on our social standing and where we live. Our law enforcement system is fundamentally broken and desperately needs to be changed, for both the safety of the police force and citizens of the country. I've had a ton of trouble figuring out exactly how to tackle the subject of police brutality. Should I bring up the statistics or individual cases? I decided to try and focus on both. I even had the idea to speak on each and every case individually. If I did a detailed examination of each and every police shooting of an unarmed victim, it would take me literally days to talk about all of them. And I could even restrict the cases to within the last decade because there are literally hundreds of examples, like the one that happened literally less than 2 weeks ago. While writing this script, another African American male was shot right here in Texas. According to ABC News, Jonathan Price was breaking up a domestic dispute when Officer Sean Lucas arrived. Jonathan Price was tased and then fatally shot by the officer. Price was unarmed. The officer's affidavit claims that Sean Lucas attempted to detain Price, but he refused. Price stated that the officer could not arrest him. The officer grabbed Jonathan's arm and attempted to arrest him. Price refused and walked away. The officer warned that he would use his taser. When Price continued to walk away, the officer fired. Price tried to reach for the taser, and then the officer fired his handgun 4 times. Keep in mind, this is what the affidavit said. The body cam footage has yet to be released. Officer Sean Lucas has been charged with murder. For my next section, I'm going to talk about some statistics of police brutality in the US and compare it to the other developed countries. I'm going to read off some statistics verbatim from policeviolencereport.org. 1,147 people were killed by police in 2017. Officers were charged with only 13 of these cases, 1% of all killings by the police. Most killings began with police responding to suspected nonviolent offenses or cases where no crime was reported. 89 people were killed after police stopped them for a traffic violation. 149 people were killed by police were unarmed. 170 people killed by police were allegedly armed with a knife. In 69% of cases where the person had a knife, police did not attempt another type of force before shooting them. In many countries, police routinely disarm people who have knives without shooting them. For example, police in the United Kingdom encounter knife attacks at a similar rate at US police, but handled these situations without using firearms in all but 4 cases this year. Each an extreme case where firearms were used to stop a terrorist attack. Consistent with international law, police in the UK are prohibited from using firearms except where strictly necessary after considering nonviolent and less lethal options. Only 4 states, Delaware, Iowa, Rhode Island, and Tennessee, have laws that require police to attempt other types of force when reasonable before using deadly force. Police recruits spend 7 times as many hours training to shoot than they do training to de-escalate situations. If police did not kill people who were not posing a threat with a gun, there would have been 638 fewer deaths this year, a 57% reduction. Of course, this is just 2017. Let's look at the last 5 years. I could go further back because those statistics are still applicable, since there hasn't been any major national reform for decades, but for the sake of brevity, the last half decade will do just fine. I got these statistics from the Washington Post. 965 killed by police shooting in 2015, 957 killed by police shooting in 2016, 990 killed by police shooting in 2018, 1,004 killed by police shooting in 2019, 839 killed by police so far in 2020, according to mappingpoliceviolence.org. The numbers vary depending on which site you go to, but the general consensus is that it's about 1,000 shootings per year. According to Statista.com, the rate of police shootings per 10 million residents in America is 33.5. That's more than Canada, Australia, the Netherlands, New Zealand, Germany, England and Wales, Japan, Iceland, and Norway combined. For this next section, I'm going to get into some examples of police brutality. This section was pretty difficult to put together because I had to gather the information by watching the examples myself. I probably could have listed even more than I have here, but I've seen so many at this point, I'd like to move on to a less stressful project soon. The fact of the matter is that when you get pulled over by a police officer, you have no idea what to expect. All you see is a uniform. Most interactions will probably be good, but in the back of your mind, you're aware that if you slip up, you could potentially be in trouble. And worse than that, if a police officer abuses his power, you could be the one to blame. This comply or get shot mentality we have with the police is simply not acceptable. Not to mention that it's inherently flawed. We've seen numerous times that you can be killed by law enforcement, even if you are complying. Black Lives Matter focuses on the violence committed to African Americans along with other injustices. But while black people may make up the majority of the statistics, we're all just a bad apple away from having our lives taken from us. George Floyd's fatal mistake was not getting in a police vehicle because he was panicking. When the officer involved in the George Floyd incident showed up to Floyd's driver's side, he was aggressive. Keep in mind that George Floyd's crime at the time was attempting to use a counterfeit $20 bill. The officer tapped on the glass with his flashlight to get George's attention. When George attempted to step out of the vehicle, the officer told him to stay in the car. The officer began yelling at Floyd to show his hands. As Floyd repeatedly apologized, the officer yelled at him to put both his hands up. The officer pointed his gun at Floyd, yelling, "Put your effing hands up." The officer tells Floyd to put his hands on the wheel as Floyd panics. He yells, "Put your effing hand up there," as George tells the officer he had been shot before. The officer keeps cursing at George as George repeats that he has been shot before. This whole interaction puts George in a heightened emotional state. He starts crying. The officer orders George to step out of the car. George tells him that he will, clearly still distressed. The officer gets impatient and motions him to step out of the vehicle. As he is doing this, George turns to him and says, "Okay, Mr. Officer, please don't shoot me." George pleads this several times. He notes that he just lost his mother. Despite all this, the officer continues to impatiently command George to step out of his vehicle. The officer moves to pull George by his arm, while George continues to beg the officer not to shoot him. George yells, "Okay, okay, okay," as the officer continues to forcefully pull him out of the vehicle. The officer says, "Get out of the car. Put your effing hands behind your back." As the cop continues to roughly handle Floyd, he tells him to stop resisting, as George tells him that he's not. Of course, this is just a small portion of the incident that led to George Floyd's death, but it is clear that the way the officer treated George Floyd led to his panic. George Floyd remained in this heightened emotional state until he was told to get in the police cruiser, when he struggled to get in due to his account of being claustrophobic, of claiming to be claustrophobic. The officer's response was to take him to the ground and kneel on his neck for 8 minutes and 46 seconds, while 2 other officers pinned him down, one on his torso and one on his legs. All of this despite George never posing a threat to the officers. Regardless of what you believe caused this man's death, one thing is for certain. The police were way too aggressive with Floyd and created a much more problematic situation than there needed to be. Sandra Bland's case is a strange one. She was pulled over for a traffic violation. She gave the officer who pulled her over attitude, and he forcefully arrested her. Sandra's cell phone footage shows the officer points his taser at her, yelling he will light her up. Sandra gives the officer a hard time as he calls for backup. She calls him a coward in much harsher language for what she perceives to be an abuse of power. Sandra states many times that she can't wait to take this to court. As the female officer arrives, Sandra is taken down to the ground off camera, and it's convenient that this officer decided to pull Sandra away from his dash cam to make his arrest. Bystander footage shows that the female officer had her knee in Sandra's back. Sandra exclaims that she had her head slammed to the ground and is epileptic, to which the male officer replies, "Good." The female officer follows up by saying, "You should have thought about that before resisting." Now, it's very important what the female officer said. The comply or else mentality is very much a part of our police force culture, which needs to change. Sandra Bland was not a threat. She was a threat to the officer's ego because she was insulting him. But once Sandra was in handcuffs, there was nothing this restrained woman could have done to this man that would have been considered close to a threat, especially when you consider the mace, the taser, and the firearm on the officer's hip. Sandra Bland was found hanging in her cell with a trash bag over her head 3 days later. Her death was ruled a suicide, which I find strange. How did this woman manage to hang herself in a jail cell? Why was she placed in a cell that was off camera? Why was she not placed on suicide watch? Why was she even held in jail in the first place for a failure to use her turn signal on a traffic light? Why would a woman with so much fight in her decide to end her life in a jail cell, especially when she had said multiple times that she was eager to take the police to court? The officers who arrested Sandra Bland have been fired. Several mentally handicapped individuals have been shot for not understanding what was happening. Charlie Kinsey is a mental health worker who was with his autistic patient. Despite lying with his back to the ground, with his hands in the air, he was shot at 3 times. One bullet struck Kinsey in the right leg. When he asked why he was shot, the officer responded, "I don't know." The officer was found not guilty for 2 counts of attempted manslaughter. Daniel Prude was killed while in police custody, despite being unarmed and completely naked. Officers responded to a mental health crisis. Prude had removed all of his clothes prior to the police arriving. Police aggressively approach him and yell, "Get on the ground and don't move," several times, one with a taser in hand. Prude follows instructions with no problem. Police note that he has blood on his wrist, likely from smashing a car window nearby. Prude is still having a mental episode whilst on the ground in handcuffs. Cops are laughing at Prude's actions. Prude gets verbally aggressive as officers just stand there and watch him. He yells stuff like, "Give me your gun." The cops put a spit bag over his head after Daniel says he has COVID. Eventually, Daniel tries to get up, but 3 officers put him back on the ground. One officer puts his hands on Daniel Prude's head. He grips his head and pushes him down into the pavement. Prude's speech becomes muffled. As the officer pushes his head into the pavement, he says, "Stop, calm down." Another officer says, "Stop, you're gonna get tased." Officer Mark Vaughn says, "Stop spitting," and then puts his knee on Prude's head. Officer Troy Talladay has his knee on Prude's torso. One shot of the body cams show that the officer's full body weight was pressed down on Daniel Prude's head. About 45 seconds after Prude stops breathing, the officer finally gets off of his head and says, "You good, man?" Officers continue to laugh after Troy Talladay notes that Prude coughed up some water. Officers note the lack of response and that he doesn't have chest compressions and calls an EMT over. Officers finally turn Prude on his side and then perform CPR. The EMT notes that the expelled liquid was likely PCP. Daniel Prude may have been suffering from excited delirium. The officers involved have not yet been charged. They have been suspended with paid leave, a vacation. The police could have just taken Daniel Prude to the hospital, but instead left him handcuffed on the ground for half an hour while it snowed. There is no excuse that you could come up with for them to treat a man like this. His sister had called the police for help, and Daniel Prude ended up dying for it. There have even been scenarios where people have been shot for simply reaching for their ID too fast, such as the Philando Castile shooting, where he stated he had a licensed gun, but was shot 7 times by the officer for reaching for his ID. The officer was acquitted of all charges. Tamir Rice, a small child, was shot for carrying a replica toy gun. The 12-year-old boy was shot almost immediately after police arrived on the scene. Officer Loeman, the man who shot Tamir Rice, was deemed emotionally unstable and unfit to be a police officer in the Cleveland suburb of Independence. The Cleveland police never reviewed his personal file before hiring him. As I was putting this together, I noticed that all of my examples were made up of almost entirely African American shootings. I wanted to show that you could be brutalized by the police regardless of your skin color. So I watched the Ryan Whitaker body cam. Police were responding to a domestic violence call made by a neighbor. They knocked on his door, announcing that they were police one time. Ryan opened his door with a gun behind his back. The officer shot him 3 times in less than 4 seconds after Ryan opened the front door to his apartment. To be more accurate, the time I got was 3.41 seconds. Ryan didn't pose an immediate threat. He had the gun behind his back and began kneeling to drop the gun as soon as he noticed that it was police. The police shot him as he was kneeling. Now, you could argue that the police announced themselves and that Ryan shouldn't have had the gun, but any person can go banging on your door and claim they are police. The police did not immediately call for an ambulance after shooting Ryan Whitaker. The officer who shot Ryan, Jeff Cook, was placed on non-enforcement assignment. When you consider the Second Amendment, it puts you in quite a predicament when someone goes knocking on your door in the middle of the night. One of the main reasons it exists is because you have to have a means to defend your home. But there are several instances where individuals show up to their door with a gun and police shoot them out of fear of being shot themselves. So you have this situation where you need to be vigilant enough to defend yourself from a potential threat, but you also need to be cautious enough to not appear as a threat to the police, or you may risk getting shot. Breonna Taylor is a case that has garnered a lot of public attention. Her death and the court ruling that followed have been the source of many protests in America. 3 officers executed a no-knock search warrant at Breonna Taylor's home. Breonna's boyfriend, Kenneth Walker, noted that the police did not announce themselves. Almost a dozen witnesses state that they did not hear the police, aside from one. The police report states that they did in fact announce themselves, but the report also says that Brianna's injuries were listed as none. Her boyfriend attempted to defend his home by aiming downwards and firing around at the door, injuring the leg of one of the 3 officers. Breonna Taylor was shot 5 times. The 3 officers fired a total of over 20 rounds in response to the single round fired by Kenneth Walker. She had no warrants, no criminal history, and no drugs were found in the apartment. The police's biggest lead was Breonna Taylor's association with her drug-dealing ex-boyfriend. Taylor was suspected to be receiving packages from said suspect. The 3 officers were not directly charged with Breonna Taylor's death. Officer Brett Hankinson was the only officer charged. He was charged with 3 counts of wanton endangerment to people in neighboring apartments. So to be clear, the only charge that was made by the grand jury was for the bullets that missed. I gotta say, it's been difficult writing about recent police shootings. Since I started writing, new information has come up in the Breonna Taylor case. Vice News recently made their own video on the case, and the details of the investigation are messy. I cannot do it justice, so I would recommend watching it on your own time. We live in this toxic mentality where if the police wrongfully detain you, hurt you, kill you, it's more than likely your fault. We live in a society where instead of admitting that the guy with all the firepower, personnel, incapacitating equipment, and authority is in the wrong when they hurt someone, we run to look at the victim's personal history and disobedience in order to justify their abuse. And what I don't think people understand is the effect they have when they do this. When you defend the murder of an individual at the hands of the police, you're endorsing the police force to act as judge, jury, and executioner. If you love the police, you should strive to see law enforcement function as fairly and effectively as humanly possible. And to those who believe this is how the police should operate, are you going to have the same attitude if it's one of your own? Are you going to make excuses for the police? Are you going to look at your family member's drug problem, their mental disability, their previous infractions, their disrespect that led to their death? I believe there are many issues with our law enforcement that go beyond the scope of just individual police officers and their precincts. I believe it goes much deeper than just the police. We need to look at all of it. There are simply too many cases where an officer should have been criminally charged, and our law enforcement system looked the other way. Next, I'm going to talk about general problems with the police that need to be addressed. The police have a serious de-escalation issue. In many of the body cam videos I've watched, the police came out aggressive. Earlier, I read a statistic from policeviolence.org that said police recruits spend 7 times as many hours training to shoot than they do training to de-escalate situations. This needs to change. Now, I have no doubt in my mind that if an officer fires his gun at me, he's going to hit me. I am much less confident in said officer's ability to talk me down from a heightened emotional state. When an officer approaches a stranger, he has no idea what to expect. Humans are extremely unpredictable. So the last thing you would want to do is point a deadly firearm in their direction, as this may cause someone to panic. A stranger could have PTSD or some other type of mental disorder, which could result in a more problematic situation compared to if you had never threatened lethal force in the first place. Another major issue is police accountability. Many times, police officers will only lose their job when they abuse their power, if they receive any punishment at all. Losing your job should be reserved for doing your job poorly or stealing from your job, not for when you repeatedly punch a 13-year-old boy with cerebral palsy. That deserves jail time, especially when you consider the fact that an ordinary civilian has no power to stop the physical assault of a police officer. What adds on to this lack of accountability is qualified immunity. According to National Public Radio, qualified immunity means that government officials, like police officers, can only be held accountable in civil court for violating a person's rights if those rights are clearly established in already existing case law. In other words, any potential violation needs to be classified as a civil rights violation beforehand, and it has to have happened in the exact same way. For instance, repeatedly punching someone in the face while they're in their vehicle and punching someone repeatedly while they are on a train are two completely different situations. The circumstances have to be the exact same for the police officer to be held accountable. The event that took place, but the problem is when an officer can't be held accountable, the event that took place will never be classified as a violation of someone's human rights, which allows civil rights violations to happen perpetually. This is the core of the problem. As a police officer, you have all of the power over someone, but less responsibility than a citizen who is not a police officer. This enables the police to push the boundaries of what they can get away with in their precinct until they go too far and someone ends up seriously hurt or dead. The simple solution is to abolish qualified immunity for police officers in favor of a clear and understandable set of rules that the police force must follow or face prosecution. Officers can abuse their power by wrongfully arresting and charging you for a crime you may not have committed. They can do this because normally when it's two non-police officers, it turns into a sort of he said, she said situation. But as an officer of the law, you always have the benefit of the doubt. Being held in a jail cell for a period of time could disrupt your life, potentially even costing you your job. If the police can find a justifiable reason, or if they just make one up, they can hold you for up to 76 hours depending on the severity of the crime you're being accused of. Many will argue that the law enforcement system disproportionately favors the rich. Having to post bail in order to get out of jail is inherently unfair to the poor. Expensive tickets for misdemeanor crimes trivialize the police's role of protecting and serving. Having to pay $150 for a speeding ticket will set you back about 21 hours of work before taxes as a minimum wage worker. This problem is only exacerbated by collar quotas and police officers looking to wrongfully use their power to inconvenience others. And if you want to argue that you don't deserve the ticket, you have to sacrifice what little time you have to go through the system and get it repealed. Speaking of tickets and arrests, collar quotas need to be abolished. The purpose of the police force is to protect and serve, not meet an arbitrary quota of arrests, citations, and tickets. Let's talk about the phrase, all cops are bastards. I disagree with the statement. Almost all cops are good people. However, the job police officer cannot have any bad apples. Otherwise, how are the people supposed to trust the police? I do not believe the police themselves are the problem. It is the system they operate in. Without a broken system, there would be no cops abusing their power and getting away with a slap on the wrist. And while yes, there are many cases that do not get a public attention, the ones that often do have results that the public strongly disagree with. I believe that one problem with the chain of command in precincts is entrenched power. You could have a corrupt person in power for years, even decades, and when someone is corrupt, they tend to surround themselves with like-minded individuals, which in some cases results in a completely corrupt system from the top down. The one thing we need above all else is accountability. When an overzealous police officer oversteps and doesn't get appropriately punished for misusing his authority, and other potentially overzealous officers see this, this enables them to believe that if they overstep, they will not get punished for it. Now, I've heard the argument that if a cop lets a bad cop get away with something, they are also a bad cop, which does make sense on paper. So I wanted to touch on the gang mentality of some precincts. Certain precincts function as a sort of gang, complete with a brotherhood style. Cops generally don't rat each other out and cover for each other when they break code. You can see this in many precincts when you attempt to tell on a police officer to a police officer. cops who try to speak up are often ostracized by their precinct. In some extreme cases, cops will be fired or isolated when on call. As a police officer, if you're looking to expose corruption through whistleblowing and you get caught, your career is over. Even if you manage to keep your job after telling on other police officers, you can kiss your hopes of being promoted goodbye. So with that in mind, you are left with two choices as an officer who witnesses misconduct. You can either tell on the officer and potentially put your entire career in jeopardy, or pretend it never happened and keep your job. I'm not implying it is morally correct to keep it to yourself, but it is important to acknowledge the ultimatum it puts you in. Okay, with everything else out of the way, let's get into police reform. Originally, my focus had been on police brutality, but now it has shifted towards police leadership. The one thing we need above all else is accountability. When a police officer oversteps his authority, they need to be held to a higher standard than that of a regular citizen. This would deter officers in the future from potentially overstepping, which would decrease the number of police shootings, which would decrease the number of protests, which would decrease the number of potential injuries and casualties because of the chaos of large gatherings of people feuding with the police. We have over 18,000 precincts and no national standards. I understand that that national standards involve getting the government involved, and some people dislike big government, but the country is massive. There are certain systems that we cannot afford to be run state by state, run on a state by state or even city by city basis. We need consistency in the police force in our country. CPS is a great example of this. You can find numerous documentaries about the failings of the Child Protective Services. In other countries with much lower police shootings, arrests, and citations, their officers will train for 2 to 3 years. Here in the US, we train officers for 10 to 36 weeks. This needs to change. It takes lawyers about 7 years in most countries to practice the law, but it takes an American police officer about half a year to enforce it. Policing is a very dangerous job, and if we want quality policing, we must pay for quality policing. The police need better training and evaluation before becoming police officers. With better evaluation, we can prevent the police force from having bad apples in the first place. Current on-duty police should all reapply to become a police officer. They must take new evaluations in order to weed out potential bad apples. We need to take a look at the chain of command in our precincts. We must dismantle the gangs that our police forces have become. Police officials responsible for faulty reports, withholding information, or covering for bad eggs must be removed from the system. The workload of the police is too large. They function as a sort of one-size-fits-all organization for most emergency situations, and as a result, the police officer is spread too thin. This is the basis of defunding the police, reallocating funds to other social systems such as drug rehabilitation, education, and mental health. If there is no immediate threat, such as a situation where emergency help is needed for a mental health crisis, we can send the appropriate expert, instead of a guy with less than a year's worth of training and a gun. So, with better training, thorough evaluations, increased pay, and reallocated funding, the situation is going to vary from precinct to precinct. Some may have too much funding, while some may have too little, depending on the city. If we need additional funding to support the changes to the precincts, while also supporting other social systems, we have two major options for acquiring the funding. Option 1. Defund the military. The U.S. Department of Defense's current budget is approximately $721.5 billion. According to the Peter G. Peterson Foundation, we spend more on the military than the next 10 countries combined. The foundation also has a discretionary spending breakdown in the U.S. for 2019. Defense accounts for about half of this spending. That's as much as transportation, veterans benefits and services, education, health, administration of justice, internal affairs, general government, housing assistance, natural resources and environment, general science and technology, community and regional development and training, employment, and social services all combined. We need to take a long, hard look at what the military is doing with such a massive budget, especially when many of the U.S.'s problems are internal. Our military force is unnecessarily massive and is scary to underdeveloped countries. If we ever needed to use the full force of the U.S. military, it would likely be the end of the world. And unless all of the spending is going towards nuclear warhead defense, what is the point exactly? Defending the military would go a very long way for funding these social systems that have been running on fumes for years. Option 2, tax the rich. Talking about billionaires is going to require its own video, but if we're going to have individuals who make an overwhelming majority of the income in our society, it is only logical for them to pay the majority of the taxes. The existence of a billionaire has been called into question lately. In the most expensive coastal cities in America, it costs about $350,000 a year to live comfortably as a middle-class citizen. $1 billion is 1,000 millions. With the $1 billion, you can afford to live middle class in an expensive coastal city for 2,881 years. The most wealthy individual on the planet is worth $118 billion, and there are 614 billionaires currently living in America. These people have more money than they could ever spend by themselves. After a certain point, it's more akin to a scoreboard than a means of survival. This money can be much better put to use to help move our society forward. And while yes, philanthropy is a thing, these billionaires pick and choose very small amounts of their wealth to go to specific organizations. It's mostly done for positive PR anyway. I mean, it's cool that these guys give a few million to organizations every once in a while, but $1 billion is 1,000 millions. So, yeah. And that's the end of the video. I'm sorry it took so long. I want to say thanks to everyone who supported me while making this project, and I want to thank everyone who subscribed after watching my first video on the coronavirus. Your support means a lot to me. Man, could you believe I was almost going to talk about the protests, BLM, Antifa, and the concept of racism on top of all this? This video would have been like an hour and 30 minutes long. My channel has an assortment of playlists of all the videos that I watched in preparation for this video, and even more. All of my sources will be cited in this description, and I currently plan for my next project to be finished by mid-late November. Thank you all for watching.